Good morning, Eastridge Chapel class. I've got a lot of stuff that I want to cover this morning, so I'm going to actually dive right into the content. We're continuing today our series of face-to-face encounters with Jesus, and then what we can pull from those face-to-face encounters. This is actually part 3. It's the first time I've done a three-parter. Part 3 of an exploration of John chapter 9. In this chapter, Jesus and the disciples have encountered a blind man, and Jesus has healed the blind man. In those first 2 weeks of exploration, here are the takeaways from those first couple of weeks in very short order. One is to focus on healing and not focus on blame. We see that really early in the dialogue between Jesus and the disciples. Next, avoid legalism. Also kind of in that same area where we find focusing on healing and not focusing on blame. Next, God can and does use pain and suffering for his purposes. We see this in the life of this blind man. And then finally, healing is unique and it might be strange to other people. That is a point, that last one, that healing is unique and that it might be strange to people. That is, first of all, it's a normal part. It's a common theme of these face-to-face encounters with Jesus. When he heals people, it's really important for us to recognize that for the other people who aren't involved in that healing, it looks very odd. That's the reason it keeps coming up in these explorations. But it's also important to know because I think it's going to set the stage for what happens next. The rest of this chapter can be summed up by it's the investigation into this miracle that has taken place. Verses 8 through 12 of John chapter 9 give us a great example of the last few points that we just explored about God using pain for his purposes and about healing being unique and strange to other people. This blind man has been healed. We talked last week about how he had muddy spit in his eyes and then he had to go wash in a pool, but he's healed. He's walking around Jerusalem and people are talking. We find in verses 8 through 12, we find this again, sequence of events where people are asking each other, is that the blind guy? No, that's not the blind guy. It looks like the blind guy, but I don't think that's him. And verse 9 contains one of my favorite lines. There's a lot of good one-liners from this guy in this chapter. Verse 9 is one of my favorites. I'm going to read verse 9 of John 9 to you. Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. Okay, you can read that in the explanatory way that he was probably saying it. He was probably saying, no, I'm the blind man. Or you can read it the way it sounds in my head, which is, some said it is he. No, but he is like him. And he kept saying, I am the man. That's the way it sounded in my head. It was very, I'm the man. Like, that's kind of how it sounds to me. It's very, I'm the manish. Either way, doesn't matter what the tone of his voice was when he's saying it, you get the idea. This guy who has now been healed by Jesus is making sure everybody knows it was him, and everybody knows that it was Jesus who healed him. The people want to hear the story, and in verse 11, he tells the story. All right, so this guy's proclaiming that not only is he healed, he's proclaiming why he's healed, and he's doing it seemingly with pride. So then in verse 13, we get to the Pharisees, and that's where things get interesting. I want to mention two things about the Pharisees before we get into this passage in verse 13. First, they get a bad rap in these types of classes and these types of conversations because they oftentimes embody hypocrisy and the mindset that Jesus frequently battled, spiritual pride, spiritual arrogance. But they believed themselves to be protecting the sanctity of God. There's a noble undertone to that. The problem was they used that belief as a means to pride and to inflating their own sense of power and authority. Believing yourselves to be the gatekeepers of God's kingdom will have that effect on you. If you believe that you are the ones determining who is in and who is out, that's a very, very, very short trip from that mentality to debilitating pride. Second, and I've said this before about the Pharisees, I feel sympathy for the Pharisees. They were so locked into what they believed to be true that they missed the literal human incarnation of Jesus standing in their midst. This is another moment in John 9. This is another moment where we see that reality. The Pharisees had decided who Jesus was, and at least some of them just weren't going to let facts get in the way of that. The blind man was brought to them. They ask, how? How is it that you can see now? And in verse 15, the formerly blind man answers that question. Let's read together verse 15. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Facts. The blind guy gives them facts. He put mud on my eyes, I washed my eyes, and now I can see. And at that point, we begin to see some division amongst the Pharisees. For some of the Pharisees who heard this testimony, the miracle is a footnote. Instead, they focus all of their energy on the fact that Jesus did it on the Sabbath. Verse 16, let's read verse 16 together. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." I said a minute ago that I feel sorry oftentimes for the Pharisees because they let their preconceived notions prevent them from seeing the miraculous works of Jesus who is in their presence. In this moment, I find it baffling that a person could be so jaded and so determined to affirm a previously held conviction that he could hear an account of a blind man since birth being granted sight by having mud rubbed in his eyes, and his first thought be, he can't be from God, he did it on the wrong day. But we see that a lot, actually, with the Pharisees. They are determined to prove themselves right. And so they view the miraculous things that Jesus did through the lens of, how can I critique this? How can I complain about it? How can I pick it apart? They see miracles and only consider how they can criticize those miracles. I want to say this as clearly as I can. That is a very, very sad way to live a life. If we as humans decide that we are opposed to something, anything, we decide I'm opposed to this belief or this ideology or this behavior, we tend to view it through that polarized lens. We won't concede a thing because we feel like it weakens our stance. I think we're seeing a lot of that in our culture right now. You've heard me talk for weeks now about how the conversations that need to be had to drive our culture forward are nuanced conversations where people have to be willing to see the rightness in other people's perspectives and to be willing to see the wrongness in their own. Now, that doesn't mean that this person's argument is right and yours is wrong. It means there's elements of right and wrong in both. And if you can't see that, then you're not going to be able to drive the conversation forward. But when we believe or decide as human beings that something is something, we tend to view it through a polarized lens. This is the root of a phenomenon known as confirmation bias, which we've covered before, and it's a very dangerous way to think. It's where we only acknowledge that which furthers what I already believe to be true, and I ignore or dismiss everything else. If I don't like a politician, I will refuse to concede that occasionally they do good things, or they have good policy, or whatever. If I do like a politician, I will refuse to concede that they occasionally do bad things. That is a confirmation bias, and it's viewing the world through a polarized lens. The thing is, that's our cultural messaging for 2020. For the record, viewing the world this way makes debate way, way easier. If I decided that everything you say is wrong, then I never have to actually listen to you. Nuance is complicated, and it takes a lot of time. Just believing that every word you say is wrong really simplifies the process. That's also something I've said before. That mentality is a product of our culture in this world, and it's a product of social media. I won't lecture you on that again. I've said it before, though. Social media deals in extremes and absolutes. I think there's a Star Wars quote about that. But as a result, we've created a society where we convince people that they have to fully and sometimes religiously hold to extreme convictions and battle everyone who disagrees. But to step outside, you've heard me do the cultural thing before. If you haven't, I did a video a couple of weeks ago called No More of This, where I really intentionally went into a conversation about social media. If that's interesting to you, go back and watch it. But for now, I want to move out of the societal realm and I want to move to families for just a second, because confirmation bias in a family can be a massive problem as well. So let's talk about what that looks like. Teenagers, if you have decided that your parents don't know what they're talking about, then you're going to miss moments where they do and where that knowledge could really benefit you. I won't do a class on this yet, but at some point we will. I want you to remember, teenagers, Samson's most memorable problem was that he married the wrong woman. But his biggest problem was that he didn't listen to his parents when they tried to tell him that. I'm right about that. Go look it up. Parents, if you've decided that your teenagers don't know what they're talking about, you're going to miss the moments where they do and where that knowledge could really benefit you. No, your teenagers don't have your perspective. They don't have your wisdom of years. But yes, they do have valuable insight that will help you parent them more effectively. And you have to listen to them that way. You can't dismiss everything your teenager says as, oh, he's a kid, he don't know what he's talking about. Okay, that may be true, but you still can't dismiss a teenager that way, because there are moments where it won't be true. There are moments where your teenager absolutely knows what he or she is talking about, and that knowledge would benefit you. If we as husbands and wives have decided that our spouse is always wrong, then we're going to miss the moments where they're not. We're going to be told that we're not listening, and for the record, that's going to kind of be true. For the record, you've heard me talk about this in relation to family before, but we also do this to ourselves. I'm going to talk about those of you who are really hard on yourselves. There are times in our own lives where we've made decisions about who we are, decisions about what we are. I'm a failure. Nothing ever works out for me. I'm no good. And because we dig in so firmly to those beliefs, we completely miss the amazing gifts that God has given us and the amazing things that God is doing for us. I want to challenge you this morning to get out of your confirmation bias as it relates to your families and to the relationships that you see around you. But let's go back to the text. The Pharisees are now debating. Some say that because Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he can't possibly be who he claims to be. Others say, well, hang on. How could a sinner do what he's doing? So we've got some pushback within this debate. We've got some people saying, wait a minute. What he's doing is crazy. It's miraculous. We have to consider that, which is a good way to consider it. So they ask for the testimony of the formerly blind guy. He keeps his words very simple and to the point. They ask who he believes Jesus is, and he says, a prophet. Full stop. The Pharisees can't figure out what to make of this, so they just go back to not believing it at all. So they called the blind guy's parents in. They asked them. That happens in verse 19. Let's read, beginning in verse 19, a couple of verses here. Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. Like their son, they stick to observable facts. This is because, for the record, they're afraid. Verse 22 goes on to tell us that the Pharisees had already made it clear that anyone who says that Jesus is the Messiah would be banned from the synagogue, which was essentially to be put out of Jewish society. So they were afraid of what the reaction would be if they were honest. So they bring the blind guy back in and they question him a second time. Again, I keep calling him the blind guy, the formerly blind guy. They question him a second time. The exchange that comes next is so perfect. It's so dry. It's so deadpan comical. I'm just going to read it in its entirety. It begins at verse 24. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, though, is that I was blind, and now I see. They said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I've told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Honestly, I could do a whole series on this, but God has a sense of humor. The Bible has moments that are very funny, and this is one of my absolute favorites. This guy tells the Jewish authorities I told you already. Why do you want more? Do you also want to be one of his disciples? That is a gutsy response to what was being placed in front of him. The dude's amazing. He's being sarcastic with the most powerful men in his community. Just wanted to pause and say that the kind of anti-authority me really likes that response. I could imagine me saying something similar to my high school principal, which I think I did at some point. All right, let's pick up reading in verse 28. And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." So our favorite formerly blind guy has confronted them with irrefutable proof, and he did it comically. He basically tells them, look, you know what he did, and you know he couldn't have done what he did if he were anything other than who he's claiming to be. So he's got him. There's no logical way out of this argument. So the Pharisees then do what virtually all of us are guilty of doing from time to time. They can't argue with the message, so they shoot the messenger. Verse 34. They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us?" And they cast him out. Folks, if you find yourself in an argument, and the only response you can think of is, "Well, you're an idiot," you've lost that argument. Personally attacking the messenger doesn't negate the message. The Pharisees were bested, so they took the coward's way out. They took a shot at the guy who bested them, hoping to destroy his argument in the process. Chapel class of Eastridge, please don't stoop to this level. I'm only going to dip a toe in political waters for just a second. It's an election year. There's chaos already. Debate is okay. Debate is important. It can lead to growth. But don't be afraid of being proven wrong, because being proven wrong means you learn something. And taking a shot at the character or at the totality of another human being because they've made a point that's counter to yours, that's a good point that's hard to argue with, shows weakness, and it shows arrogance and pride. Admitting you were wrong is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of maturity. Admitting you were wrong is a sign of confidence. Think about the most confident people you know. By and large, they're willing to admit moments where they're wrong. That's what true confidence is. People with confidence aren't confident because they're right all the time. They're confident because their sense of self can withstand being wrong. They can even grow from it. Confidence is not knowing you're going to be successful all the time. Confidence is knowing you can deal with failure. There's a very, very big difference between those two things. And the Pharisees give us a picture of what weakness, I think, looks like. In this moment, the Pharisees could have said, okay, you're right, that does make sense. Instead, they insulted this man as a way of dismissing his argument. Again, I want to stress, we're arguing about a lot of stuff right now. I'm not going to touch on what, and I'm not going to pick a side, but I am going to say culturally, it's not hard to see. We're arguing about a lot of stuff right now. Discuss what you need to discuss and debate what you need to debate. But if you're taking personal shots at people you disagree with, to me, that's an indication of weakness, and it's an indication that your logic probably isn't holding up too well. But there's one last exchange in this passage that I don't want to miss, and it begins in verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Lord, I believe. We did a whole class on that sentence a couple of weeks ago. Just so I've said it again, I think we drastically underestimate the power of those words. Lord, I believe. They can affect your faith in powerful ways. They can even affect your mood. Are you worried about our culture right now? Are you worried about our country? Are you worried about our church? Are you worried about your community and your family members? Lord, I believe. Say those words out loud. Lord, I believe. Say them in your prayers. Say them when the news flashes another tragedy in your face. Lord, I believe. Say it when you see a social media post that actually inspires negative emotions in you. It makes you feel angry, makes you feel hurt or defensive. Lord, I believe. Try me on this. See if it doesn't calm your anxiety. Lord, I believe. When confronted with the things in this world that we feel are debilitating, when confronted with the things in this world that we're struggling mightily with, say out loud, Lord, I believe. I think you will be amazed at what the end results of that simple action can be. Let's finish this passage by looking at verse 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." So this passage, simply put, it closes, John chapter 9 closes by reminding us that in order for God to work in us the way he intends to work in us, we have to be willing to recognize our blindness. We need to recognize that without Jesus, we are lost. The problem with the Pharisees is that they relied on their own actions and their own understandings to save themselves. They didn't think they needed Jesus. They do. They did. You do. We all do. And one of the most important components of that is recognizing that without him, we are blind. Without that realization, you can't really get out of the starting gate. I know we covered a lot of ground today, and I know I talked a little faster than I have been for a couple of weeks because I'm really trying to keep the time limit down on these videos. So let me quickly recap what we've taken away from the second part of John chapter 9, the investigation. First, avoid confirmation bias. I want to point out the fact that avoiding confirmation bias entirely is a really, really hard thing to do. So if you can't avoid confirmation bias, know what it is and then recognize it when you're engaging in it. Recognizing that you've got some confirmation bias, we all do. Recognizing that we've got some confirmation bias and that there are moments where it's a real part of our reality is a really important thing for us. So recognize your confirmation bias. Next, personally attacking the messenger doesn't negate the message. Don't be afraid to be wrong. And if somebody brings a good point to you that challenges a previously held conviction or stance or opinion of yours, don't be afraid to say, yeah, actually, that's a really good point. And be willing to bend. That shows true confidence. That shows true maturity. Immaturity and no confidence refuses to back down. Confidence and maturity is open to being challenged and being swayed at times. Next point. Lord, I believe. I'm just going to make that a point. Lord, I believe. It is a very powerful phrase, and it needs to be a part of our prayer life and a part of our lives in moments where we struggle. Folks, Lord, I believe. If that's true, say it out loud. It'll have an impact on the way you think. I will probably at some point do an entire class on input, output, and how psychologically some of these little CBT, which doesn't mean a lot to you right now, some of these functional ways in which we have to impact our thinking. I'll do an entire class on how that input output can be adjusted. This one, Lord, I believe, is a really simple way to consider this. Lord, I believe. Goodness. You're watching the news and something flashes on the screen that horrifies you. Say, Lord, I believe. What are you saying? Lord, I believe in your sovereignty. Lord, I believe in your presence. Lord, I believe in your existence. Lord, I believe in your comfort. Lord, I believe in your peace. And that's just off the top of my head. I imagine if you spent some time really unpacking the idea, Lord, I believe. And then let me challenge you to say, you believe what? Lord, I believe. And then fill in as many blanks as you can. Man, Lord, I believe. Almost being a reaction when you see something stressful. Lord, I believe. I think you will be amazed at the tangible impact that has on the way that you view chaos in the world. Our final point for this morning is to recognize your blindness. More than anything else, I think this second half of John chapter 9 encapsulates the idea of pride. The Pharisees exhibited it. The blind man did not. Jesus, of course, did not. And I think for us, one of the biggest takeaways is getting over ourselves, which is the second time now in this exploration I've used that phrase. I used it in the last video as well. Getting over ourselves is an important part of allowing God to do what God can do. We are going to pick up next week with a special edition of our Eastridge Corona series videos. We're going to stick with the face-to-face encounter, but I'm going to have a special guest with me as we continue our exploration. Until then, thank you for spending this time with me. Eastridge family, I love you. I miss you. I am anxiously awaiting seeing you very, very soon. Please keep us in your prayers as we keep you in ours moving forward. I look forward to spending time together very, very soon.